Good evening. Actually, I meant to say good afternoon. It'll be evening by the time I get done. It's important for me to express at the beginning my appreciation for this invitation. I am very grateful to be here at this important event for our community and for this congregation. And I want to particularly express my gratitude, there you are, my gratitude to Paula Devon. She's been more than diligent and gracious to extend, follow up, and pursue me to make sure that I followed through on the yes I gave a year ago. But let me publicly say that I now owe her a dinner. So, so somebody will hold me to that. Let's see. I also wanted to express my gratitude, of course, to Reverend Alstein and to Reverend Devon for providing the venue and the occasion for our celebrations tonight. To all the participants, the deacons, the committee, the members of this congregation, local clergy, and community leaders, for each of you who have come out this evening, I thank you. And we are grateful that you take seriously this shortest month for the opportunity to remember the longest history of Black Americans. I also should add that all of my family is Baptist, so my mom is real happy that I'm in a Baptist church this evening. I'm not going to preach tonight. You've invited a professor of preaching, a pastor, but tonight I want to speak to you. I want to invite you to prayerfully think about the opportunity that we have in the 21st century to tell our story. And the particularity of the story that we tell is that as the people of God, we tell His story. We tell of the world the way the world cannot imagine except for the revelation of God. A story that is handed to us in Scripture and preserved generation after generation, that race, class, gender, politics, status, none of that matters. Because the only thing that matters is that God has looked at each one of us to remind us that He labored over a lump of clay to name us, created in the divine image. And when we tell that story, everything that has been the dirty trails of our lives becomes edited by the Creator. And so I want to challenge you tonight to think about the stories that you tell and to ask you if you can recognize that evidence of the decline in American culture emerges in African American communities. That we recognize that evidence of the decline in American culture emerges in the African American community. From violence to voyeurism, from wages to welfare, public safety to prison sentences, the DNA of America's societal decay can be viewed in the African American experience. Public displays of the problem continuously stream in the news media and on reality TV. No longer imaginative productions such as West Side Story or real-life crime dramas like In Cold Blood. Today, merely channel surfing the evening news or watching an episode of basketball wives, regularly flaunts domestic violence, neighborhood destruction, and the general underachievement among Black citizens, evidence of a decline. Social media outlets from Twitter to YouTube now provide what parents and grandparents once told us over the dinner table. Now, when I was a child, I learned the perspectives of adults when my parents and uncles and aunts would engage in that somewhat civil discourse of gossip. Come on, let's be honest. Much of the bickering born of interpreting what someone heard rather than understanding what someone meant, regardless of the words that fell out of their mouth. But I digress. As a child, when we ran through the house to pour a glass of Kool-Aid or grab a baseball glove or ask if we could go to the park, we were privy to a bit of that strange concerns that occupied the imaginations of adults: politics, pregnancies, employment procedures. And to the best of my memory, when I was 12, those things meant diddly squat to me. The death of JFK was too far back in history to matter. The crash of the stock market in '87 happened before I had anything of value to lose. And abortion wasn't an option because the children were raised by the family and the community in our neighborhood, regardless of how many parents they had. Now, don't get me wrong. I remember when Nixon overstated that he was not a crook, which seemed more of a Shakespearean protest because I grew up watching Shirley Chisholm display the character and will not to accept the status quo when running for the Democratic presidential nomination. This isn't the first time a woman's been on that ticket. I still have the diary where I entered my first payment for babysitting, a whopping $2.30. I think that included a tip. And then pregnancy still was something that occurred for a moment of celebration, predominantly within marriage, at least in my community. But times they are a-changing. Segregation and white flight provided a bit of protection against flagrant racism in my neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. I came of age when King's dream was in the imagination of all Americans, after affirmative action, and in time to watch Oprah Winfrey unseat Phil Donahue for afternoon television viewers. Some of you remember those times. It seemed at that point in my life that the prayers and aspirations of our foreparents, the hopes for decent employment and solid education, and the security of home ownership might just be a reality. Yes, times, they were a-changing. Racially segregated in northern cities by redlining, and in the south by the location of the family homestead. Access to television and theaters enabled the imaginations of all citizens to be teased and tainted by the promise of success and exposure to sensuality. And I remember hearing preachers and late elders lament the loss of the community resulting from our assimilation into the larger community. But at that time, I didn't know to divide it by race. I just thought that we were good Christians and there was the rest of the world, and we were supposed to be peculiar in it. I know other Christians recognize the cultural deterioration that's going on and genuinely desire for change to move us forward. But unfortunately for some, it's like the proverbial frog in the kettle. It's difficult to think you're in trouble because you think you're just in a jacuzzi and you're on your way to a boiling point. Truth be told, the evidence of the trouble we're in is overwhelming. But like many courtroom dramas, from the Scopes trial to Judge Judy, the discovery of truth is not as important as the theatrical display. As Jack Nicholson's character noted in A Few Good Men, we can't handle the truth. The very idea is problematic. Truth has almost been irrelevant in an effort to validate experience. Whose story are you telling? What experience is important for you to narrate? The news has given us a new history. Ferguson riots, police shootings, polling reports, race, power, fear, opportunity. And because of incidents across the country in just the last 2.5 years, and the subsequent media coverage, echoes of long rehearsed scripts fill our ears. Profiling, brutality, protest, violence. And whatever came to your mind as you heard those words, new scripts are being written across the country. Militarized police state, man tasered, fatal shooting. For some, these are the necessary responses to the escalating violence whenever African Americans gather. For others, these constitute updated forms of mob lynchings and nightstick beatings. Such polarizing responses expose a haunting divide among us. We are divided because we have been told a story that has formed our imagination. That story told to us makes us think we understand reality. And this narrative does not divide us by age or class or gender or sexuality. It divides us by an idea: race. When will we recognize that the decay in African American communities is this very idea? It is America that is in decay. The evidence is now evident in our community, but it's always been there. I've wanted to put this in writing, and I dare to say this to you tonight, so let me make an apology for myself. Some of you are probably wondering how I got to be the keynote tonight. After all, this is a celebration of Black history, right? Somebody should have sent me the memo. But let me ask you, if it's your child's 10th birthday, and you've planned this humongous celebration, invited all the family and friends, rented Chuck E. Cheese's, brought day passes for Disney, whatever you do to celebrate this singular occasion in your child's life. In the morning of the events, your child wakes up with food poisoning from last night's dinner at Chipotle. Sorry about that. Or maybe they failed a maneuver on their skateboard and now they have to have surgery to put a pin in their leg. Or maybe you wake up to a flood in your house due to a pipe bursting. Or worst case scenario, your house is on fire. If something unexpected and tragic, but not uncommon or unheard of, happens on that day, what happens to your plans for celebration? Do you tell the EMTs or the fire department to wait until tomorrow because you have plans for today? Do you tell your child that cotton candy will make them forget how sick they feel to their stomach? Do you tell your friends to come on over, you'll host the party without the kid? Forgive me for this over-dramatization. But I want to suggest that maybe a gathering of persons of goodwill, such as tonight, is the very time to discuss the decay of American culture that is affecting the Black community so completely. Maybe the gathering of a people of faith in a house of worship during a season of incomprehensible political posturing. Maybe we are the ones maybe now is the time to reconsider everything that is before us. So give me just a few more moments of your hearing. I'll leave you alone after that. But I remind you, not everyone everywhere is celebrating Black History Month. They're asking questions. Why is it always about race? When can I speak and not be labeled? They are among the many who are weary with the rants of racism, discussions of diversity, and pleas for political correctness. I suspect that some of you who are in this room are like myself, no less weary. We too are fatigued because the familiar narrative is a false tale. There's no space here for me to rehearse the history of the modern civilization that has written this tale, but the visual media reinforces the script, making us voyeuristic consumers of a socially constructed farce. It begins in the present because how we understand today is dependent on the narratives that we've received from the past. And how we tell the stories of yesterday depends on the questions we ask today. It's why a harvest is dependent on the seeds that are planted. So many of our narratives of civilization ignore those who are not the militarized men with money who won the wars. Historical narratives change over time because we know about the past, because we are asking different questions and we're speaking to different hearers. We can see the changes clearly today on occasions like this one that fill in those events and moments that were left out before the civil rights revolution of the 1960s, before Black people began to be seen as Americans. In the past, relatively few readers of history wanted to know anything about what African Americans were doing or thinking. How odd that the country that once claimed to be the melting pot of the world only preserved the narratives of those men who believed themselves to be white. One writer put it this way: imagine two friends run into each other after a couple of years apart, and the one begins a long narration about the strange jobs they've had and the places they've visited. And then without taking a breath, he moves from one topic to another and then glances at his watch and says, "Oh, I've got to meet someone in 10 minutes. Sorry, it was great to see you. Let's get caught up again sometime," and he's gone. And the second person nods, but she feels like yelling, "Wait, I want to tell you what's going on with me." In our culture, we've heard all about the exploits and experiences from the perspective of men who believe themselves to be white, but we have forgotten to pay attention to the lives and achievement of those the culture names as non-white. So we know pieces of our story. We know the genesis of African Americans as a New World people was the result of forcible capture and transportation of a minimum of 10 million Africans from their homeland across the Atlantic Ocean. But it's only recently that the traumatic, thorny, and until recently virtually unstudied topic of the Atlantic slave trade has been rehearsed in the narrative voice of African Americans. It was just 2013 that we heard the firsthand account of Samuel Northworth in the screen adaptation of 12 Years a Slave. Even though the writings of African persons from the 18th and 19th century have long been available. Or we know that African Americans were granted the right to vote in 1870, but only last year we paid close attention to the great lengths opponents went to prevent the exercising of that right as recently as 1965. And today, in North Carolina and in other places around the country, that fight still goes on. We tell the stories of white flight and the Industrial Revolution and ignored the great migration of African Americans did not begin in 1950s, but it can be traced back as early as 1915 when the crucial move of more than 500,000 Black persons out of the South into the North and the Midwest during the First World War. The departure of European immigrants and Northern soldiers created job opportunities for Black Southerners, many who moved on their own volition to find work before labor recruiters urged people into specific jobs. And since I'm from the Midwest, Southern California residents probably know this history better than I do, since thousands of Black people already lived in northern and western cities to which the wartime migrants moved. They're your ancestors. Black history and Black History Month is not merely the rehearsal of persons that we saw beautifully pictured on that slide presentation: W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, Absalom Jones, Richard Allen, Richard Wright, Zora Neale Hurston, Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, Angela Davis, Maya Angelou, Cicely Tyson, Thurgood Marshall, Malcolm X, Vivian Thomas, Shirley Chisholm, Mary McLeod Bethune, Madam C.J. Walker, Vashti McKenzie, and Martin Luther King. It's also the rehearsal of the events and narratives that established Black culture. And so the celebration has to pause to repeat the narratives that created the idea of whiteness in the first place. Where did we get this idea that what is good is white, that what is desirable is white, that what we aspire is white? How is it that 143 years after Lincoln signed 153 years after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, American society remains stratified by the boundaries of whiteness and non-whiteness? It is now well accepted by social scientists that the very notion of race and whiteness and its social significance are guided not by any biological foundation, but by social meaning that has been ascribed to it. But Plato is described as having once said, "Those who tell the stories rule society." And from the flickering flames of campfires to the illuminating lights of the cinema, stories have always guided tribe and tradition. And our community stories, our canon, whether it's an ancient holy book or an animated Hollywood script, it influences how we imagine the identity of those within the community and how the community imagines the outsider. We are the stories we tell. So as we think of what is good, dare we say it's revealed to us in Scripture and not prescribed to us by whiteness? Dare we say that justice is God's idea? It is the only thing the Lord requires. Dare we say you cannot have good without God and justice without Jesus? Dare we say the story we need to hear is the story of the one who created all humanity in the divine image, and not the story of how man divided us and made some of us less than human? Dare we tell that story in the 2016? Dare we shape our identity beyond the boundaries of race? Mark Laberton, the president at Fuller Seminary, invited the faculty and students and staff to read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. It's a wonderful portrayal of the pain of being an African American man and raising an African American son in light of the police brutality, the news, the stories that are spun today. But Coates doesn't problematize the very idea of race. And too often when we ask for our stories to be told, we don't want to talk about why these stories have to be told, because somebody's white and somebody's not. Instead, we want to hear the stories of victimization, and we want to hear the stories of pain, and we want to say, I'm so sorry things are like that for you. Or maybe we want to say, my clan needs to rise up above everybody else's. That type of security, that seeking for power has never been good for society. When we operate out of fear to save people only just like us, we see the decay of human society. Biblical people call it sin. Remember, we're in an election season. When someone taunts, take back our country, identify who the our is. The stories that we are telling portray us in ways that divide us instead of find a way to bring us together. So Ta-Nehisi Coates asks for those sorrowful narratives. It's a powerful book. It's brilliantly presented. But his lack of faith and belief in God, and his willingness to allow race, which he suggests isn't real, but allow his racial identity to drive him, doesn't problematize what really needs to be addressed. So my brothers and sisters, today I ask you, how did the Christian community become so comfortable with the idea of race? I understand why America decided it was true. It was economic, it was powerful, it was a way to have a class of people that could do your work and to elevate those once indentured slaves who were not from Africa to being at least poor white trash. And because they were white, being poor trash was good news. That's the story of America. But believers in God tell a different story. Those who understand God because of Jesus Christ know a different story. We follow those in the first century who, because they saw Jesus, broke down the barriers of class, of gender, of ethnicity, of religion, and began to be a glimpse of what the world will look like when Christ returns, when time as we know it ends, when every nation, every tongue, every tribe gathers together, and what they do is they worship the Creator God. Notice, in that repetition, there was no mention of race, because race wasn't in the Bible. Race as the Western idea of modernity. There was different ethnicities, there was different cultures, there was even light-skinned and dark-skinned, black and beautiful, it says. But race as we describe it today is not in Scripture. So what does it mean for us to claim that we are children of God? That we are created in the image of the Creator, and when the Creator created us, the Creator said, very good. What does it mean for us to celebrate this month, to celebrate the lives of the people who have always been a part of this country as Americans, not as blacks, not as other, not as victim? When I got my first job at a college as the chaplain, a young man walked into my office. He was 19. I was 30. He walked into the office and he sat down and he said, "I'm so glad you got this job. I'm just so excited that the college was willing to hire you. I'm so happy." And then he said, "You see, I'm sorry I was born male. And I'm sorry I was born white. And I'm sorry I was born to a family of economic means. And I'm sorry I was born straight." And I was thinking, okay, you are sorry you exist. So why should I be happy that you're happy I got the job? So I stopped him and I asked him, "I don't understand what you want me to understand." And he said, "Well, you know." And I said, "I don't think so." And he said, "Well, you know, because you're a black woman." And I went, "Yes." When I woke up this morning, I thought I still was. Yeah, it looked that way to me. Somebody better tell my mother if I'm not. And he said, "Oh, come on. You know how hard it is." And I stopped him and I said, "Wait a minute. It seems to me you think I'm a victim. That's not my story. In Jesus Christ, I have the victory." And he didn't know what to do with that. I want to suggest to you that if we make the stories that we tell in our lives from this moment forth, a story of the victory all people have because we are created in the image of a good God. If we make that our narrative, that will be confusing in this world. It will confuse the politicians. It will confuse the police. It will confuse the kids. It will confuse the grandparents. It will confuse the people who aren't in this room. But I guarantee you, if you prayerfully begin to talk about what it means to be human, and that simply means to bear the image of the divine. It means that we are glimpses of God's good. It means that we tell the world that what you see now is not what the Creator intended. And we can be a community that brings together across race and gender and age and economic status. And we come together and we're able to say that we see a better future. Because the decay in America is not because of race. The decay in America is because of sin. The decay in America is not because there are black and brown bodies in this country. That decay was here long before we got here. Let me just paint you one interesting picture. You know how frightful it is that angry, fearful white men are arming themselves? They're taking advantage of that Second Amendment, that right to bear arms. You want to know what got the Black Panthers in trouble in 1966? Somebody knows. After getting beaten and after being attacked and after being violated, they finally decided, you know, we're American citizens and we have the right to bear arms. Why do the rules look differently when they're employed by one group of people and not by another? I want to ask us to employ an entirely different set of rules. I want us to remember that the story we have to tell is the story of a God who loves us, not because of our color. He loves diversity. He made it this way. I don't understand why he made porcupines and spiders, but that's part of his variety too. Why do you tell the stories that you tell? Why do you rehearse Black history as an us versus them? What if we tell the stories in such a way that people recognize that when the people of God are able to live as witnesses to God's glory on earth, everyone experiences healing. The decay that we're watching in our society is a decay that is born of telling a bad story and placing all that is bad on one group of people and all that is good on another, so that we ignore sin on this side and create it on this side. That's not God's way. And I know not everyone in here confesses Jesus Christ as Lord, but I don't have hope in the government. I don't believe that 153 years after emancipation and 50 years after civil rights that I can put my hope in a government that wrote a law to make sure that my people were thought of as less than human. And do you understand that 3/5 idea? It was the North that made that decision on behalf of the South. That decision was made because there were so many black bodies in the South, enslaved as they were, that if they had equal representation, the North would not have a chance in the Congress. So when we know our history, we know that our history is filled with decay. It is filled with brokenness. It is filled with lies and violence and destruction. But there's a story before that narrative began. It's before the brokenness of Genesis 3. And it begins in the beginning, before time as we know it. It was when the Creator God began to form a people with whom the Spirit of God so evidently abided that their behavior caused others to notice that there is a God and God's intentions for this world is good. What story are you telling? One more from me. A few years ago, I went to the best racial awareness diversity participation event I'd ever been in and I've ever been in since. When I walked out of there, I was angry. I knew my history. I knew my grandmother's history. And I had been nice to too many of the wrong people for too long, and I walked out with a chip on my shoulder, and I was going to make up for all the stuff that I had let slide. I got up that morning and I broke my mother's rules. I put on jeans and a sweatshirt, and I was going to go shopping. Had my hair in a scarf. Some of you know what that looked like back then in the Midwest. But I had to go and get my coffee, so I drove through McDonald's, and I met the happiest white person on the planet. Good morning! Would you like a cup of coffee? How many creams and sugars? And I was like, roll down the window so she can see who it is in here. And she thought I wanted to talk to her, and she just chatted, and I went, fine, okay, good. Give me my coffee and let me go find some stupid person, because that's who I need today. So I went shopping. Nobody followed me around the store. When they asked me if I wanted help and I said no, they said, okay, I'll be over here. And they went over there. This was not working out the way I planned, but I knew what to do. I went to Denny's. Now I should tell you something if you haven't figured this out. If there is a major food chain that is being sued for racial discrimination, that's probably not the time to go and expect to be discriminated against. I walked into that Denny's, it was breakfast time, there was a line of 57 people in front of me. The waitress came out in a parking lot and gave me a seat. I only exaggerate a little. And as I placed my order, and began to thank God for my food, before I could say thanks, God spoke to my spirit. And God said, there are stupid people out there. You being the top of them today. But it's not everybody. And if you forget what your mom taught you, how can this world ever be different? You see, my mother taught me that if I treat white people badly because they're white, I give them permission to treat me badly because I'm not. What story are you telling? The decay in America is now evident in the African American community. It did not start there. When I was growing up, our homes were intact, and Hollywood showed us moving on up with the Jeffersons. I learned about divorce through the Brady Bunch. That's how I learned about blended families. So I ask you, where are you getting your stories from? In your own homes? There's somebody you need to say I'm sorry to? In your neighborhood? Is there somebody you need to speak to? On the job? Is there somebody you need to say, I want to talk to you, but I won't hear those jokes anymore? Because how you live in your family, in your neighborhood, and on the job is a demonstration of what it means to be created in the image of a good God. Not black, not white, but what it means to be human. So the seed that I want to plant in your imagination tonight is not merely a seed of the history of my people, but is the history of God's people. The people who make their story God's story. You see, the black community had no story to tell. The Africans in their multiple languages were wiped out. They weren't allowed to be next to anyone who could tell a story of back home. And so they heard this story because the masters were stupid enough to introduce them to God. And when they heard this story, they recognized that there is a God who created them human. They didn't accept the master's religion. They accepted the master's God. And it changed their narratives. Brothers and sisters, I thank you for listening to me tonight. I ask you, change your narrative. Tell the story of all God's children, black and white, red and yellow, brown, the people that Jesus died for. When you talk about the decay in America, don't allow it to look like it's only on the side of town where brown and black bodies live. The problem that we have of drug abuse, of domestic violence, the problems that we have of depression, of undereducation, of poor unemployment, these problems are American problems. It's just that right now you can see them most clearly in the African American community. That's how bad it is. And the only hope is if the people of God will tell a different story. A story of a God who has changed history by always turning chaos into beauty. And he started with your lives. Tell that story. Amen.